When my father married a woman who cared more about status than family, I kept the $80 million my late grandfather left me a complete secret. It turned out to be the smartest decision I ever made. Just days after their wedding, my father's new wife showed up at my door uninvited with a smug lawyer at her side, ready to throw me out on the street. She had no idea the trap she was walking into. My name is Natalie. I am 33 years old, and my family has always measured worth in dollars and cents. As an architectural preservationist, I spent my life restoring forgotten history, a career my father Richard called a garbage man's job. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. It was 8 in the morning on a Saturday when the heavy oak door of my estate rattled under a series of violent knocks. I was standing in my kitchen, the smell of freshly brewed espresso filling the air, wearing my usual weekend overalls. I pulled the door open to find Brenda, my father's new wife, wearing an ostentatious fur-lined designer coat that looked entirely out of place on my porch. Standing right beside her was a man in a cheap suit carrying a leather briefcase, a smug smile plastered across his face. Brenda did not wait for an invitation. She shoved her way past me, her high heels clicking aggressively against the restored 19th century hardwood floors. The lawyer followed close behind, looking around my home with blatant disrespect. She marched into my study and threw a thick stack of legal papers onto my antique drafting table. The heavy thud echoed through the quiet house. "Sign the vacate order, Natalie," Brenda demanded, crossing her arms over her chest. "Your father just transferred this entire estate to Kyle's investment portfolio. Your little pile of historic bricks is getting bulldozed on Tuesday to make room for luxury condos. We already have the zoning permits approved, so do not even think about fighting this." I did not flinch. I calmly walked over to the side table, picked up my ceramic mug, and poured myself a cup of hot coffee. The steam rose between us as I took a slow sip, letting the silence stretch just long enough to make her lawyer shift uncomfortably. "Is that right?" I asked, keeping my voice perfectly level. "Richard sent his new wife to do his dirty work. I suppose that makes sense. 10 years ago, my father sat in his office and refused to pay a single cent for my college tuition. He told me to take out predatory loans because architectural preservation was nothing but a glorified garbage man's job. He said there was absolutely no money in saving old things." Brenda sneered, her lip curling in disgust as she looked at my drafting tools. "He was absolutely right. You are 33 years old, and you are still squatting in a decaying house. You have made nothing of your life, Natalie. Sign the paper right now, or we call the sheriff to have you physically removed. You have nowhere else to go." I smiled, not a forced smile, but a genuine, relaxed expression that clearly unnerved her. I walked over to the drafting table, picked up the thick legal document, and flipped through the first few pages. It was a standard eviction notice, poorly drafted and completely unenforceable. I walked over to the roaring fireplace in the center, held the document over the open flames, and let go. The fire caught the dry edges, instantly consuming the paper in seconds. "Are you out of your mind?" Brenda shrieked, taking a step forward. The lawyer finally spoke up, his voice loud and aggressive. "That is destruction of legal property. I am calling the police now for trespassing and destruction of property. You are definitely going to jail." Pierce stared at the flames licking the edges of his meticulously drafted vacate order. His face turned a dangerous shade of crimson. He jammed his hand into his tailored suit jacket and yanked out his smartphone. He announced he was dialing the police immediately. He shouted that burning a legal document was a criminal offense and that I would be in handcuffs before breakfast was over. Brenda stood beside him, her arms crossed, looking incredibly satisfied with the chaotic turn of events. She told me I had finally gone too far and that my arrogance was going to cost me my freedom. Before Pierce could even press the call button, the heavy front door swung open again. It banged loudly against the brass doorstop. Kyle marched into the foyer. Brenda's son was the picture of arrogant entitlement. He wore a designer hoodie that cost more than most people made in a month, and bright white sneakers that were completely caked in fresh mud from the driveway. He did not bother to wipe his feet. Instead, he purposely dragged his muddy soles across the 19th century Persian rug that lay in the center of the entryway. I had spent 6 months carefully restoring that rug by hand, pulling centuries of dirt from the delicate silk threads. Kyle looked down at the mud tracks he was leaving and let out a short, mocking laugh. He strutted further into the room, kicking one of my antique drafting compasses off the edge of a side table. Kyle looked around my painstakingly preserved home with an expression of pure disgust. He told me the place smelled like dust and failure. He bragged loudly that his new real estate investment fund was going to flatten this entire estate by Tuesday. He said his architects had already drawn up the blueprints for a sleek, glass-fronted luxury condominium complex that would cater exclusively to crypto investors. He leaned against a restored mahogany bookshelf, completely ignoring the fragile wood, and asked if I was going to cry when the wrecking balls arrived. He offered to let me keep a single brick as a souvenir of my pathetic attempt to save a rotting piece of trash. I did not yell. I did not rush forward to examine the mud on my antique rug or the drafting compass on the floor. I stood entirely still, watching the three of them revel in their assumed victory. Pierce had the phone pressed to his ear, waiting for the emergency dispatcher to answer. Brenda was adjusting her fur collar, looking at me as if I were a pest waiting to be exterminated. Kyle was scrolling on his phone, already bored with the destruction he was causing. He began loudly chewing a piece of gum, acting as though he already owned the very floor he was standing on. I reached into the pocket of my overalls and pulled out my phone. I did not dial the police. I simply opened a messaging app and tapped a single pre-programmed button. A silent signal sent to the adjacent room. 10 seconds later, the heavy sliding pocket doors that led to the library rolled open with a smooth, quiet glide. Mr. Caldwell stepped into the study. Caldwell was not just a lawyer. He was a legal institution in the city. He wore a charcoal gray three-piece suit that looked as sharp as his reputation. His silver hair was perfectly combed, and his posture radiated a cold, unwavering authority that immediately sucked the oxygen out of the room. He was not a man who engaged in shouting matches or empty threats. He operated on fax documents and an encyclopedic knowledge of estate law. In his right hand, he held a crisp, unmarked manila folder. Pierce froze with his phone halfway to his mouth. He recognized Caldwell immediately. Any attorney operating in this state knew who Caldwell was, and they knew better than to find themselves on the opposing side of a courtroom from him. The smug satisfaction drained from Pierce's face, replaced by a sudden sharp realization that he had stepped into a situation he did not fully understand. His hand slowly lowered the phone away from his ear. Caldwell walked with measured, deliberate steps until he stood directly between me and Pierce. He did not raise his voice. He spoke with a quiet, lethal precision. He instructed Mr. Pierce to end the phone call immediately. He warned that if the authorities arrived, the only people leaving the property in handcuffs would be Pierce, Brenda, and Kyle. He stated that making a false police report would be the end of Pierce's already questionable legal career. Pierce tried to stammer out a defense. He claimed he represented Richard, the lawful owner of the estate, and that they had every right to execute an eviction. He pointed at the fireplace ashes, insisting I had destroyed their legal notice and was actively trespassing on Richard's newly transferred property. He tried to puff out his chest, but under Caldwell's icy stare, the effort failed miserably. Caldwell did not even blink. He slowly opened the crisp manila folder and extracted a single, perfectly preserved document. It was a registered property deed stamped with the official seal of the county clerk. Caldwell slid the document across the coffee table until it stopped exactly in front of Brenda. He looked directly at Pierce and delivered the killing blow. He stated that Pierce and his client were deeply and embarrassingly mistaken about the ownership of the property. He explained that Richard did not own the estate, had never owned the estate, and possessed absolutely no legal right to transfer it to a luxury condo development fund. Caldwell pointed a manicured finger at the deed. He explained that my late grandfather Theodore had legally transferred this entire property into an independent company owned solely by me 5 years ago. You have exactly 60 seconds to vacate before I have you all arrested for breaking and entering." Brenda stared at the document on the coffee table, as if Caldwell had just dropped a live grenade on the glass. All the color drained from her perfectly bronzed face. She blinked rapidly, her mouth opening and closing without producing a single sound. Kyle crossed his arms and told his mother not to listen to this fake lawyer. He insisted it was just a printed piece of trash and demanded Pierce do his actual job. Pierce did not look like a man looking at a piece of trash. He leaned forward, his hands trembling visibly as he picked up the heavy parchment deed. He adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses, his eyes darting across the dense legal text, desperately searching for a loophole, a missing signature, a mismatched date. He flipped to the second page, then the third, his breathing becoming shallow and ragged. I watched a thick bead of sweat form at his temple and slowly roll down the side of his reddening face. He swallowed hard, clutching the paper as if it were burning his fingertips. Pierce turned to Brenda, his voice barely a whisper. He told her the deed was legitimate. He explained that Theodore had executed an irrevocable transfer into a blind trust and corporate LLC 5 years ago, entirely bypassing the probate process. He said Richard had zero legal claim to the property. He said they needed to leave immediately. Brenda snatched the papers out of his hands, crumpling the edges in her manicured grip. She glared at Pierce, her voice shrill with panic and fury. She accused him of being an incompetent fool. She demanded to know how a senile old man could hide an $80 million estate from his own son. Caldwell smoothly stepped forward and plucked the documents right back out of her hands. He informed her that Theodore was of exceptionally sound mind. He added that Theodore specifically designed the trust to protect the estate from opportunists who preferred stealing wealth over earning it. Caldwell then looked at his gold pocket watch. He noted that they had exactly 30 seconds left before he called the precinct commander directly. Kyle finally seemed to grasp the reality of the situation. His arrogant smirk completely vanished. He looked at his mother, panic rising in his voice. He asked her what this meant for his investment fund. He reminded her that she promised him this land as collateral for his startup. He said his investors were expecting the demolition photos on Tuesday. Brenda shushed him aggressively. She turned her venomous glare back to me. If she could not win legally, she was going to burn my life to the ground, socially and financially. She took a step closer, pointing a trembling finger at my chest. She told me I was making a catastrophic mistake that I would pay for the rest of my life. She said a piece of paper might temporarily save my rotting house, but it would certainly not save my career. She reminded me that my father Richard sat on the executive board of every major historical society and architectural foundation in the state. She boasted that he personally controlled the funding, the grants, and the private donations that kept my independent preservation business afloat. She warned me that his influence reached into every corner of the industry. She stepped closer, her designer perfume suffocating in the small space between us. She hissed that by tomorrow morning, I would not have a single preservation contract left in the city. She swore Richard would blacklist me across the entire coast. She painted a picture of my future where my clients would drop me, my suppliers would cut my credit lines, and my hard-earned reputation would be shredded in the high society circles. She told me I would be begging on the streets within a month, wishing I had just signed the house over when I had the chance. I looked at her trembling finger, then up to her furious eyes. I did not raise my voice. I did not show an ounce of the fear she desperately wanted to see. I simply smiled. I told her to tell Richard to try. I reminded her that my clients hired me for my unparalleled expertise, not because my father wrote checks at charity galas. I explained that while Richard was busy kissing up to local politicians, I was out doing the actual work that kept the city history alive. I leaned in and told her that if Richard wanted to declare a financial war, he was welcome to fire the first shot, but he had better be prepared for the absolute collateral damage. Brenda let out a short, sharp laugh. It was a cold, calculating sound that lacked any real humor. She realized in that moment that she could not break me by threatening my career. I had built my business from the ground up while she spent her life marrying into wealth. She needed a different angle of attack. She needed to hurt someone I actually cared about. She slowly buttoned her expensive coat, her eyes scanning my face for a weakness. She found it. Brenda tilted her head, her voice dropping to a dangerously calm register. She said it was truly a shame about my little sister Zoe. She mentioned how happy Zoe had been since marrying Xavier. She praised Xavier, calling him a brilliant, dedicated trauma surgeon who had worked his entire life to open his new private clinic. My stomach gave a tiny involuntary lurch, but I kept my face perfectly still. Brenda noticed. Her smile returned wicked and triumphant. She told me she had not planned to use the nuclear option today. She said she originally wanted to keep things simple and just take the property. But since I wanted to play hardball, she would show me what real power looked like. She walked toward the front door, her heels clicking a steady rhythm. Kyle and Pierce scrambled to follow her, eager to escape Caldwell. Brenda stopped at the threshold and turned back to face me one last time. She said Richard was currently holding the primary funding contract and the commercial lease agreement for Xavier's new surgical clinic. She casually mentioned that it would be a real tragedy if Xavier's private investors suddenly pulled their backing because of an ugly, fabricated financial scandal involving missing hospital funds. She said it would absolutely destroy Zoe's new marriage to see her ambitious husband lose everything he had worked his entire medical career for simply because her older sister refused to surrender a piece of dirt. Brenda looked me dead in the eye. She told me I brought this on myself. She promised that by tomorrow, Xavier would be ruined, Zoe would be heartbroken, and it would all be my fault. She walked out, pulling the heavy oak door shut behind her with a resounding slam. Exactly 24 hours later, the dominoes began to fall in rapid succession. I was standing in my kitchen reviewing the structural blueprints for my most lucrative project, the complete restoration of the 1920s downtown Orpheum Theater. The restoration was months in the making. My phone buzzed. It was Marcus, the head of the City Historical Preservation Board, and one of my father's oldest golfing buddies. His voice was unnaturally tight, lacking his usual booming cheerfulness. He did not bother with pleasantries. He flatly told me the board was going in a different direction, and my contract for the theater was terminated effective immediately. I asked for a reason, knowing exactly what he was going to say. He stammered out a pathetic excuse about unforeseen budget reallocations and hung up the phone before I could ask a single follow-up question. 5 minutes later, my primary building materials supplier called to inform me my commercial credit line had been completely frozen. 10 minutes after that, a wealthy socialite client texted to cancel her massive estate consultation, claiming a sudden and unavoidable scheduling conflict. The blacklisting was swift, coordinated, and utterly ruthless. Richard was clearly calling in every favor, cashing in every piece of social capital he possessed across the state to financially starve me out of my own home. He wanted me desperate. He wanted me begging for my job back so he could force me to sign over the property deed to Brenda and Kyle. They believed I would cave under the immense pressure of absolute financial ruin. Anyone else would have panicked and surrendered. I simply tossed my phone onto the kitchen island and poured myself another cup of black coffee. I walked back into the library where Mr. Caldwell was sitting at my antique mahogany table. He had arrived an hour earlier carrying a locked leather satchel. He did not look surprised when I told him about the sudden wave of cancellations. He merely adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses and laid out a series of highly classified offshore bank statements across the polished wood. I sat across from him, completely unbothered by the persistent buzzing of my phone as more of Richard's high society friends jumped ship and severed ties with my company. Caldwell pointed a manicured finger to a highlighted column of numbers on the top page. He explained that my father was burning through his social connections to ruin my business completely, unaware that his own financial house was actively burning to the ground. I traced the printed numbers with my finger, examining the complex offshore routing codes Brenda had utilized to siphon millions of dollars out of my father's private equity accounts. Brenda thought she was squeezing me into submission, but these heavily redacted documents proved she was quietly draining Richard dry to fund Kyle's failing ventures. She was playing a desperate high-stakes game of distraction, hoping Richard would be too focused on destroying my career to notice the massive hemorrhaging of his own wealth. I leaned back in my chair and tapped my pen against the table. I told Caldwell that Brenda was acting like a cornered animal. I pointed out that the sheer volume of money moving through these Cayman Island shell companies was staggering. The audacity of her theft was truly breathtaking. Caldwell nodded in agreement, noting that Brenda was leaving a digital footprint that even an amateur forensic accountant could track. We sat in companionable silence, meticulously cross-referencing the dates of the offshore transfers with Kyle's recent cryptocurrency investments. The correlation was undeniable. Brenda was literally stealing from her new husband to subsidize her arrogant son. We were just beginning to untangle the complicated web of shell companies and fake vendor invoices when my phone screen lit up with a different name. It was Zoe. My younger sister rarely called me during my work hours, and she certainly never called me while she was on shift at the hospital. Zoe was a dedicated pediatric nurse, fiercely protective of her patients, and even more protective of her husband, Xavier. Xavier was a brilliant trauma surgeon who had spent the last 5 years working grueling shifts to secure the funding for his own private surgical clinic. Richard had agreed to provide the final bridge loan for Xavier's clinic, a move I always knew came with dangerous strings attached. I answered the call fully expecting her to ask about our upcoming weekend plans or to vent about a difficult patient. Instead, the sound of ragged, heavy sobbing filled the speaker. My heart stopped beating for a fraction of a second. The absolute terror in her voice sent a cold chill down my spine. I stood up from the table, my grip tightening on the phone, and demanded to know what was wrong. Zoe could barely catch her breath, her voice trembling so violently I could hardly understand her words. She managed to explain that Brenda had just called an emergency family meeting at my father's corporate headquarters. Zoe had driven straight there from the hospital expecting news about our grandfather's estate, or perhaps a forced apology regarding the eviction notice. Instead, she walked into an ambush. Brenda had stood up in the middle of the boardroom and thrown a massive binder of financial ledgers onto my father's desk. The binder was filled with hundreds of pages of forged records. Zoe choked on another sob, the panic radiating through the phone line. She was completely inconsolable. She explained the devastating trap Brenda had just sprung. Brenda had somehow manufactured documents that painted Xavier as a criminal. Zoe's voice broke completely as she delivered the hook that Brenda had promised the day before. Natalie, Brenda just told Dad to pull the backing for Xavier's new surgical clinic. She showed Dad fake ledgers claiming Xavier is secretly embezzling from the hospital network. They are going to ruin him. The bell above the heavy glass door of the Silver Spoon Diner chimed a dull metallic note as I pushed my way inside from the rain. It was a discreet, run-down establishment on the very edge of the city limits, the kind of place where people went specifically to avoid being seen by anyone they knew. The air inside smelled strongly of stale, dark roast coffee and fried grease. I scanned the row of cracked vinyl booths lining the back wall and immediately spotted my younger sister. Zoe was curled tightly into the corner of the furthest booth, clutching a crumpled wad of paper napkins in her lap. Her bright green eyes were red-rimmed and swollen, her face a mask of absolute despair. It was a stark contrast to her usual confident professional demeanor as a dedicated pediatric nurse. Sitting directly across from her was Xavier. Unlike his wife, who looked like she was standing on the precipice of a sheer drop, Xavier was the absolute picture of composed, unwavering tranquility. He was dressed in his dark navy surgical scrubs, his broad shoulders relaxed and his posture perfectly straight. He was casually taking a slow, measured sip of black coffee from a thick ceramic diner mug. He did not look like a man whose medical career had just been threatened with complete obliteration. I slid into the booth next to Zoe, pulling my damp trench coat tight around my shoulders. Zoe immediately thrust her smartphone toward me, her hands shaking so violently that the text on the screen blurred together. She frantically tried to show me a series of highly aggressive text messages Brenda had sent her, detailing the exact criminal charges she planned to push through the hospital board by the end of the day. Zoe choked on another heavy sob, repeating over and over that Richard was pulling the bridge loan and that Xavier was going to lose his medical license before his new private clinic even poured its concrete foundation. Xavier calmly set his coffee mug down on the chipped formica table. He reached over with a steady hand and gently took the phone away from Zoe, placing it face down and completely out of her sight. He looked directly at me, his dark eyes sharp, focused, and completely devoid of panic. "Natalie, ignore the tears," Xavier said, his voice a low, soothing baritone that commanded instant respect. "I do not need your father's dirty money for my clinic." Zoe let out a breathless sound of confusion, wiping her face with the back of her sleeve. Xavier simply reached into the brown leather messenger bag resting on the seat beside him. He pulled out a thick, heavy stack of printed financial ledgers. They were exact copies of the documents Brenda had dramatically thrown onto Richard's desk just hours prior. He spread the papers across the diner table, smoothing out the creases with the same deliberate, methodical precision he used in the operating room. He tapped his index finger against the top page of the stack. He explained that Brenda had marched into Richard's office and presented these records as definitive, undeniable proof that Xavier had been siphoning massive amounts of capital from the main hospital network to secretly fund his private venture. He pointed to the columns of red ink detailing hundreds of thousands of dollars supposedly missing from the hospital's surgical equipment budget. Brenda had woven a very convincing narrative for Richard, playing perfectly on his deep-seated fear of financial scandal and public embarrassment. "Brenda is an absolute amateur," Xavier stated, a faint, humorless smile touching the corners of his mouth. "She fabricated these ledgers thinking I was just a doctor who only knew how to hold a scalpel and read charts. She made a catastrophic miscalculation. She did not realize I sit on the hospital's internal audit board." I leaned forward, my eyes scanning the rows of numbers as Xavier began to dissect the forged financial records with surgical precision. He pointed out the glaring, elementary inconsistencies, the mismatched transfer dates, and the incredibly clumsy attempts to cover up the origin of the missing capital. He dragged his finger across a series of complex transaction codes that Brenda had foolishly tried to bury beneath fake vendor invoices and phantom equipment orders. He explained that as a senior member of the audit board, he had immediate, unrestricted access to the true financial master files. When Richard had furiously confronted him with Brenda's fake ledgers an hour ago, Xavier had not argued or raised his voice. He had simply logged into the secure hospital database from his phone and pulled the real verified numbers. He stated unequivocally that the hospital was not missing a single dime. The equipment budget was perfectly intact, balanced down to the very last cent. He looked up from the scattered papers, his gaze locking onto mine with absolute terrifying certainty. "These funds were not stolen by me," Xavier said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "They were never in the hospital accounts to begin with. They were routed directly out of Richard's own private equity firm." I stared at the ledgers, my mind racing as the puzzle pieces clicked together perfectly. Brenda had not just fabricated a crime to ruin Xavier. She was actively using Xavier as a highly convenient scapegoat to hide her own massive ongoing theft. She knew Richard was deeply paranoid about his wealth, and she needed a distraction large enough and shocking enough to keep him from noticing that his own investment accounts were bleeding dry. By framing his son-in-law for corporate embezzlement, Brenda had effectively weaponized Richard's legendary anger, pointing it far away from her own illicit actions. He slid the final page of the forged ledger toward me, pointing to the bottom corner with a steady calm. "Xavier taps a specific routing number. And guess where the money is going? A shell company in the Caymans registered to a Web3 startup." The drive across the city to Richard's corporate headquarters took exactly 18 minutes. My hands gripped the steering wheel of my truck so tightly my knuckles turned completely white, but my mind was operating with a cold, mechanical clarity. Xavier had just handed me the master key to their destruction. He had completely dismantled Brenda's pathetic attempt at a frame job and handed me the precise financial routing numbers that proved her guilt. The money meant to ruin my brother-in-law was actually feeding the very crypto startup Kyle had been bragging about in my living room. They were using stolen hospital funds to inflate a fraudulent digital empire. I pulled into the visitor parking lot of the sleek glass and steel tower my father ruled from. This was the fortress where Richard orchestrated his grand schemes and crushed anyone who stood in his way. Today, however, I was not walking in as a victim or a rejected daughter looking for approval. I marched through the heavy revolving glass doors with a singular, unbreakable focus. The lobby security guard was a new hire who clearly did not recognize me. He stood up from his marble desk holding up a hand and demanded to see my identification badge before I could proceed to the elevators. I did not break my stride. I looked him dead in the eye, told him to call Richard directly if he had a problem, and walked straight past the security turnstiles before he could even reach for his shoulder radio. I knew the layout of this building perfectly well. I had spent my childhood running down these halls when my grandfather owned the company. I stepped into the private executive elevator, slid my access keycard over the scanner, and hit the button for the top floor. The ride up was silent, giving me exactly 40 seconds to channel every ounce of anger, betrayal, and frustration into a weapon of pure precision. The elevator chimed softly as the polished steel doors slid open to reveal the quiet penthouse corridor. The heavy mahogany double doors at the end of the hallway used to belong to my grandfather Theodore. Richard had taken over the space, but the imposing entrance remained exactly the same. When I reached the doors, I did not bother to knock or ask his secretary for an appointment. I raised my heavy work boot and kicked the center where the doors met with enough force to make the brass handles violently slam against the interior drywall. The loud, echoing crash rattled the expansive corner office. Sitting behind my grandfather's massive vintage desk was Kyle. He was wearing another ridiculous designer outfit, leaning back in the plush leather executive chair, with his muddy sneakers propped up right next to a pristine crystal decanter. Scattered around the room were 4 older men in expensive tailored suits. They held sleek digital tablets and looked completely startled by my sudden aggressive entrance. On the massive flat-screen television mounted against the far wall, a presentation slide displayed the glowing animated logo for NovaChain. Kyle was right in the middle of a high-stakes pitch. Kyle dropped his feet from the desk instantly, his face flushing with a violent mix of shock and immediate rage. He quickly tried to mask his panic with a loud, arrogant laugh, glancing at his potential investors to assure them he was entirely in control of the situation. He threw his arms wide and addressed the room, loudly announcing my arrival with dripping sarcasm. He called me the family garbage collector. He told the men in suits that I was simply a desperate, unstable relative who played with old bricks and ruined buildings for a living. He leaned forward, resting his elbows heavily on the desk, and asked if I was here to beg for a loan because my preservation business had suddenly dried up overnight. He reached for the polished desk phone and told the investors not to worry, stating that security was already on the way to escort the trash out of the building. I did not flinch. I did not shout back or defend my business. I walked right past the men in suits, completely ignoring their bewildered stares and nervous whispers. The scent of Kyle's expensive cologne clashed with the stale smell of corporate desperation in the room. I kept my eyes locked entirely on the massive television screen. The dashboard for his precious crypto application was broadcasting live server metrics in bright neon green numbers, showing a continuous stream of fabricated transaction volumes meant to impress the gullible men sitting behind me. I stopped right in front of the screen, letting the ambient hum of the servers fill the heavy silence. I stood there watching the data packets stream across the digital interface, tracing the exact pathways Xavier had shown me on the printed ledgers. I noted the specific server identification tags flashing across the bottom corner of the display. The numbers aligned perfectly with the offshore documentation Caldwell had secured for me. Kyle was incredibly foolish to leave his back-end architecture completely exposed during a pitch meeting. This would bury him permanently. I let out a slow, deliberate breath, letting the tension in the room build until Kyle shifted uncomfortably in his stolen chair. The older investors exchanged highly confused looks, their confidence in the arrogant golden boy clearly wavering by the second. I watched the smug satisfaction completely drain from his pale face. as his shaking hand hovered awkwardly over the telephone receiver. He suddenly realized that his reckless, amateurish digital fingerprints were now completely visible to anyone who knew exactly where to look. I turned my head slightly, looking at Kyle over my shoulder. I gave him a cold, knowing smirk. Nova chain. I said, my voice echoing loudly and very clearly across the absolutely silent office. Hosted entirely on the Apex Cloud infrastructure, right? Did you actually read Clause 4.2 of your hosting agreement, Kyle? Before Kyle could stutter a response, the heavy mahogany doors violently swung open. Richard stormed into the room like a hurricane. His face was mottled crimson, his suit jacket flaring open as he marched aggressively toward me. He had clearly been alerted by the security guard downstairs. His eyes locked onto me with absolute disgust and unbridled fury, entirely ignoring the four highly lucrative investors sitting frozen in their chairs. He stepped between me and the television screen, blocking my view of Kyle's fraudulent server metrics. He pointed a trembling finger directly at my face, his voice booming with the practiced authority of a man used to absolute obedience. He demanded to know what I thought I was doing, disrupting a pitch meeting. He did not ask for an explanation. He immediately assumed I was the erratic, jealous daughter trying to ruin his golden stepson's moment of triumph. I stood my ground, my posture rigid, and refused to let him intimidate me. Richard lowered his voice to a lethal, threatening register, making sure every person in the room heard his final ultimatum clearly. You are an embarrassment. Kyle is building the future and you play with old rocks. Sign the house over, apologize to Brenda, and I might let Xavier keep his medical license. He stood there expecting me to crumble under the sheer weight of his conditional love and financial threats. The investors shifted, uncomfortably trapped in the crossfire of a brutal family execution. Kyle, bolstered by Richard's aggressive entrance, let out an arrogant snort, crossing his arms over his chest as if the battle had already been won. They both truly believed I was cornered. I looked at my father. I searched his face for a single shred of hesitation or a momentary flicker of doubt. There was absolutely nothing. He was a hollow corporate shell, entirely consumed by Brenda's manipulations and his towering ego. The last lingering thread of daughterly obligation I held for him snapped silently, leaving behind a pristine clarity. You do not hold Xavier's medical license, Richard, I stated, my voice completely devoid of any emotion. And you definitely do not hold Kyle's future. Richard scoffed loudly, attempting to dismiss my words as the ravings of a failed child. He commanded me to leave his building before he had me dragged out by security. I did not move a single inch. Instead, I reached into the pocket of my trench coat and slowly pulled out my smartphone. I tapped the screen and opened a highly specialized administrative application. The sleek black interface loaded, instantly displaying a glowing silver logo that perfectly matched the server infrastructure hosting Kyle's entire digital empire. Because I am the majority shareholder of Apex Cloud, I said, holding the screen up just enough for Kyle to see the master control dashboard. And your son just breached the terms of service by running unregistered offshore securities. The silence that descended upon the office was utterly suffocating. The victorious smirk vanished from Kyle's face, replaced by unadulterated terror. He lunged forward, his hand slamming onto the desk as he stared at the device. Richard looked frantically between my phone, the television screen, and his suddenly pale stepson. I took a deliberate step forward, turning my attention directly to the four investors who were watching me. I explained exactly what they were looking at on the screen behind him. I detailed how NovaChain was not a revolutionary financial application, but a hollow facade constructed entirely on rented server space that I legally controlled. I broke down the fraudulent data packets, exposing the automated scripts Kyle purchased to artificially inflate user engagement metrics. To ensure the investors completely understood the sheer magnitude of the fraud they were about to fund, I outlined the exact reality of Kyle's operation using clear, undeniable facts. 1. Fabricated user metrics. The active user count displayed on the screen was artificially multiplied by a factor of 10,000 using automated bot scripts designed to deceive stakeholders. 2. Offshore money laundering. The initial seed capital for the application was funneled directly from Richard's private equity firm without his authorization, utilizing untraceable Cayman Island accounts. 3 terms of service violation. Hosting illicit financial platforms strictly violated Apex Cloud Network rules, granting me the unilateral right to terminate the servers without any prior warning. Richard turned to face Kyle, his color draining as my explanation penetrated his arrogance. He demanded that Kyle explain the offshore routing codes. Kyle stammered, sweat on his forehead, frantically trying to string together a lie. He looked to Richard for protection, but my father realized he had been played for a fool. The investors did not wait for a resolution. The oldest man calmly closed his leather portfolio, stood up, and silently walked out of the office. The other 3 men immediately followed suit, their capital walking out the door with them. Kyle let out a desperate sound, watching his future evaporate. He lunged across the desk, begging the empty doorway to come back, ignoring the fact that he was actively committing financial crimes. Richard stood frozen in the center of the room, staring at the television screen. I looked down at my phone and placed my right thumb directly over the red master termination button. I told Kyle he had exactly 60 seconds to download whatever personal data he wanted before I permanently erased NovaChain from existence. Kyle began shouting hysterically, scrambling for his laptop, his fingers flying across the keyboard in a blind panic. Richard finally found his voice, turning to me with a look of profound betrayal. He asked how I could possibly do this to my family. I stared back at the man who had threatened to destroy my innocent brother-in-law and steal my home. I reminded him that failures do not belong in this family, echoing the exact toxic philosophy he had weaponized against me my entire life. My thumb pressed down firmly on the glowing red icon on my phone screen. The effect was instantaneous and absolutely devastating. On the massive television mounted behind Kyle, the bright neon green numbers that had been flashing in a rapid, continuous stream simply froze. A fraction of a second later, the entire dashboard collapsed. The chaotic web of fabricated transaction volumes, active user metrics, and server load indicators vanished, replaced by a stark, blindingly white error screen displaying a fatal server disconnection notice. The NovaChain infrastructure flatlined completely. Zero traffic, zero access, total digital annihilation. The silence in the corner office was heavy and absolute, broken only by the soft mechanical hum of the air conditioning. The 4 wealthy investors did not need any further explanation. They recognized the undeniable reality of a catastrophic structural failure when they saw it. The oldest man in the gray suit let out a low, disgusted scoff. He snapped his leather portfolio shut with a sharp crack that echoed across the mahogany walls. He stood up, adjusted his silk tie, and walked directly toward the exit without uttering a single word. The other 3 investors immediately followed his lead, their faces masks of pure professional revulsion. Kyle stared at the blinding white error screen, his jaw hanging completely slack. The reality of his ruined pitch slowly registered in his eyes. He scrambled forward, his chest slamming against the edge of the antique desk as his hands frantically battered the keys of his open laptop. He mashed the refresh button over and over, his breathing ragged and shallow. The screen stubbornly refused to change. The offshore shell company he had built using stolen hospital capital was completely offline, severed from the cloud network by a single tap of my thumb. He spun around to face me, his perfectly styled hair now disheveled and falling into his eyes. His face was twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated panic. His voice cracked, rising an entire octave as he pointed a finger at my phone. "What did you do? Turn it back on." I did not move. I stood my ground, my posture relaxed, but completely unyielding. I looked him dead in the eye, watching the sheer desperation radiate from every single pore of his body. The arrogant golden boy who had laughed at me just minutes ago was now begging. "I do not negotiate with crypto thieves," I stated, my voice echoing with absolute finality. Richard stepped forward, his face flushed an angry mottled crimson. He raised his hand, fully intending to command the room and force me into submission, just as he had done for my entire life. He opened his mouth to shout, to threaten me with financial ruin, disownment, or worse. I raised my own hand, cutting him off before a single sound could escape his lips. I looked at the man who had gladly offered up Xavier as a sacrificial lamb to protect his own ego and his new wife. I told Richard that his blind loyalty to Brenda had just cost him his reputation, his private equity firm, and any shred of dignity he had left. I explained that the investors who had just walked out that door would not keep quiet. The story of his stepson pitching a fraudulent digital currency built on stolen funds would spread through the financial district before the end of the business day. I turned my back on him, refusing to give him the satisfaction of the last word. I walked out of the massive corner office, leaving the heavy mahogany doors wide open. Kyle was still screaming at his laptop, hitting the keys so hard I could hear the plastic snapping. Richard was standing completely motionless, trapped in the reality of his own making. I strode down the penthouse corridor, my boots sinking into the thick carpet. I felt an incredible, overwhelming sense of liberation washing over me. For years, I had allowed these people to dictate my worth. I had accepted their insults, their dismissals, and their casual cruelty, because I believed blood required loyalty. They had severed that tie completely, and I had simply returned the favor. I stepped into the executive elevator and pressed the button for the lobby. The doors slid shut, cutting off the faint sounds of Kyle's ongoing meltdown. The descent felt entirely different this time. I was no longer the discarded daughter seeking validation. I was the architect of their immediate destruction. I walked across the marble floor of the lobby, ignoring the confused stare of the security guard behind the front desk. I pushed through the heavy revolving glass doors and stepped out into the crisp, cool afternoon air. The sky above the city was beginning to clear, the rain clouds parting to reveal patches of bright blue. I pulled my trench coat tight around my waist and began walking toward my parked truck. I had just dismantled Kyle's entire fraudulent operation, secured the evidence needed to clear Xavier's name, and publicly humiliated my father in front of his peers. The board would demand answers, the hospital would conduct an independent audit, and Brenda's financial crimes would be dragged into the unforgiving light of day. I reached for the door handle of my truck, fully intending to drive straight to the diner and deliver the good news to Zoe and Xavier. Just as my fingers brushed the cold metal, my phone vibrated in my pocket. A loud, intrusive notification chime pierced the quiet street. I pulled the device out and glanced at the bright screen. It was an alert from Instagram. Brenda had just gone live. She was broadcasting directly to her 50,000 high society followers. The thumbnail image showed her sitting in her opulent living room, her face streaked with ruined mascara, crying hysterically into the camera. The public relations war had officially begun. I stood motionless on the concrete sidewalk, the crisp afternoon wind whipping the heavy fabric of my trench coat around my legs, and watched the performance of a lifetime unfold on my glowing smartphone screen. Brenda was sitting squarely on the plush cream sofa in the exact living room where I had spent my entire childhood, her perfectly highlighted hair falling in carefully arranged, disheveled strands around her tear-streaked face. She was speaking directly to her 50,000 high society followers, her voice shaking with a masterful blend of manufactured terror and profound heartbreak. She did not mention the fabricated hospital ledgers or Xavier. She conveniently omitted Kyle's offshore crypto fraud and his catastrophic humiliation in the boardroom. Instead, she painted a devastatingly convincing portrait of a greedy, vindictive, and deeply unstable daughter orchestrating a ruthless campaign of financial extortion. Brenda looked straight into the camera lens and sobbed with absolute conviction, claiming that I had found a malicious legal loophole to steal the family estate and render my elderly, hard-working father completely homeless. She clasped her hands together and pleaded for privacy and prayers, wiping her eyes with a trembling hand, rapidly cementing my new public role as a heartless monster in front of the entire city. By the time I reached the heavy door of my truck, the video had already been shared thousands of times across the affluent circles and exclusive country clubs of our district. My phone began to vibrate violently against my palm, a relentless, punishing barrage of notifications signaling the swift, highly coordinated character assassination. I decided not to drive straight to the diner just yet. I needed to clear my head and project absolute normalcy, so I pulled into the crowded parking lot of the upscale organic grocer I frequented every single Tuesday afternoon. I grabbed a wire basket, selected some basic provisions from the fresh produce aisle, and calmly approached the front checkout lane. The cashier, a younger woman named Sarah, who usually greeted me with a warm, familiar smile and always asked about my architectural restoration projects, completely froze the moment she saw my face. She glanced down at her own smartphone resting on the metal register, where Brenda's tearful video was paused on the bright screen, and then looked back up at me with a gaze of absolute unfiltered revulsion. She crossed her arms tightly over her green apron and flatly refused to scan my items. She told me to leave her line immediately, her voice loud enough to draw the judgmental stares of the other wealthy shoppers, murmuring clearly that they did not serve people who abused and extorted their own parents. I left the wire basket sitting on the black conveyor belt and walked out of the store, keeping my posture perfectly straight despite the heavy, suffocating weight of the immediate public judgment. As I sat back down in the driver's seat of my truck, my phone screen lit up with a rapid succession of venomous text messages. They were from women I had known since high school, people who had attended my birthday parties and eaten dinner at my father's dining table for decades. They called me a sociopath. They called me a greedy, ungrateful parasite who was destroying a good man's legacy. They demanded to know how I could be so unspeakably cruel to a father who had given me absolutely everything. Brenda had successfully weaponized an entire tight-knit community against me. In less than an hour, isolating me completely from the social fabric I had always known. She honestly thought the overwhelming, crushing pressure of immediate public humiliation would force me to surrender, that the sheer weight of becoming an overnight social pariah would break my resolve and send me crawling back to beg for their forgiveness. The final definitive blow arrived just as I turned the key in the ignition. The screen displayed a direct private message from Richard. It was not a plea for negotiation or a demand for a face-to-face meeting. It was a cold, calculated, and brutal execution. He wrote that I was a toxic disgrace to the family name and that my unhinged actions today were entirely unforgivable. He explicitly ordered me not to even think about showing my face at Thanksgiving dinner this coming weekend. He officially banished me from the family unit, slamming the door shut with absolute, unapologetic cruelty. He genuinely thought this harsh rejection would completely shatter me. He believed that cutting me off from the sacred holiday tradition would be the ultimate devastating punishment, forcing me to recognize my supposed failures and beg for his mercy before the turkey was even carved. Anyone else would have frantically typed a furious, emotionally charged reply, desperate to defend their character, or hurl bitter insults back at the arrogant man who had just callously discarded them. I did not feel furious or upset about his text message. I felt a profound, chilling sense of total calm settle over my entire body. The loud noise of the city traffic, the stinging texts from fake friends, the ridiculous public spectacle Brenda had created, it all faded into meaningless background static. I looked at Richard's hateful, dismissive message for 5 long seconds, fully acknowledging the absolute, irreversible finality of his choice. I did not type a single word in response to him. I simply sent him a single bright yellow thumbs-up emoji. I immediately turned my phone completely off, plunging the device into total darkness and tossing it onto the passenger seat. I reached into the hidden center console of my truck, picked up my encrypted, untraceable secondary phone, and dialed a secure number I knew perfectly by heart. Mr. Caldwell answered on the exact second ring, his professional tone sharp and fully ready for immediate instruction. I stared straight through the rain-streaked windshield at the darkening gray sky and spoke with absolute, unwavering certainty. "It is finally time to open Grandpa's vault right now." The heavy steel doors of my grandfather Theodore's private vault had not been opened in nearly a decade. The air inside the subterranean level of my estate smelled of aged paper leather bindings and preserved history. We had spent the last 4 hours hauling dozens of heavy fireproof archive boxes up the spiral staircase and into the expansive formal dining room. The massive oak table, usually reserved for polite dinner parties, was now completely covered in a chaotic sea of financial documents. Towering stacks of original banking ledgers, bound tax returns, and faded corporate charters were spread out beneath the glaring brightness of the crystal chandelier. Caldwell stood at the head of the table, his suit jacket discarded, and his pristine white shirt sleeves rolled up to his elbows. He was methodically sorting through a stack of Theodore's charitable foundation records, his brow furrowed in deep concentration. Across from him, Xavier sat hunched over his laptop, his eyes darting frantically between the glowing screen and the printed hospital audit trails he had miraculously managed to secure before Brenda locked him out of the system. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 2 o'clock in the morning, but none of us felt the slightest bit of fatigue. The adrenaline of the hunt kept us entirely focused. I stood by the tall glass windows, watching the rain lash against the dark panes, drinking a cup of black coffee that had gone cold an hour ago. The public relations war Brenda was waging against me out in the real world felt completely irrelevant down here. Social media outrage and country club whispers meant absolutely nothing when compared to the concrete, undeniable evidence we were currently unearthing. My grandfather had always told me that numbers never lied, even when the people writing them did. He built his empire on strict accountability, meticulously documenting every single transaction, donation, and corporate transfer. He trusted no one, not even his own son, which was exactly why he had left the physical master copies of the Foundation's architecture in my possession. Richard and Brenda had spent years assuming the digital records they manipulated were the only copies in existence. They had grown arrogant, sloppy, and entirely too comfortable in their fabricated reality. I turned away from the window and walked back to the dining table, watching Xavier trace a line of numbers with the tip of his silver pen. He stopped abruptly, his posture going completely rigid. He dragged a heavy ledger across the polished wood, aligning it perfectly with a freshly printed spreadsheet from the hospital database. Xavier let out a sharp, ragged breath, pulling his glasses off and rubbing the bridge of his nose. The dark circles under his eyes were prominent, but the sheer shock radiating from his face instantly commanded the room. He looked up, his gaze locking onto mine with absolute clarity. The pieces of the puzzle he had been agonizing over for weeks suddenly snapped into perfect alignment. He did not sound like a defeated doctor facing a ruined career. He sounded like a man who had just discovered the murder weapon at a crime scene. He tapped the pen against the thick parchment of the ledger, his voice ringing out in the quiet room. Brenda didn't just frame me to get me fired. He stated, the realization hitting him like a physical blow. She framed me to cover up a gaping hole. Look at this. He spun his laptop around so Caldwell and I could see the screen, simultaneously pointing to a series of heavily redacted transfer orders in the hospital audit trail. He mapped out the exact financial trajectory, showing how $15 million from Grandpa Theodore's charitable foundation was bled dry over the last 6 months. The real crime was buried much deeper, hidden beneath layers of manufactured administrative incompetence. Caldwell leaned over the table, his sharp legal mind immediately analyzing the data paths Xavier had highlighted. I stepped closer, my eyes tracking the massive sums of money flowing out of Theodore's most prized philanthropic achievement. Every fraudulent record and every illegal transfer had been meticulously uncovered by my very brilliant brother-in-law. Xavier guided us through the labyrinth of transactions. It was a systematic surgical extraction of capital. Brenda had authorized dozens of incremental transfers, moving the money through a complex web of shell companies and fake vendor invoices, completely draining the foundation's cash reserves. She had used Xavier's departmental access codes to mask the final destinations, ensuring that if anyone ever looked closely, the blame would fall squarely on his shoulders. She had destroyed his professional reputation simply to buy herself a convenient scapegoat. The sheer scale of the theft was breathtaking. This was not a minor embezzlement scheme or a simple accounting error. This was a calculated, high-stakes financial heist executed right under Richard's nose. Brenda had gutted the charity designed to help underprivileged children to fund her own lavish lifestyle, and she had done it with absolute terrifying precision. Caldwell did not say a word for a long moment. He simply stared at the undeniable proof of Brenda's guilt, his hands gripping the edge of the oak table so tightly his knuckles turned white. The implications of what Xavier had uncovered were massive. Caldwell slowly stood up straight, mechanically adjusting his glasses as the true severity of the situation washed over him. The color completely drained from his face, leaving his skin a pale, ghostly white. He looked at me, his eyes wide with a mixture of professional dread and profound realization. This was no longer just a family dispute over a stolen house or a ruined medical license. This had escalated into an entirely different realm of criminality. He swallowed hard, his voice dropping to a harsh, serious whisper that carried across the silent dining room. Caldwell adjusts his glasses, his face turning pale. It's worse than theft. The Foundation is a federally monitored entity. She used it to float Kyle's collapsing crypto exchange. The gravity of Caldwell's realization hung in the stifling air of the subterranean vault. A federally monitored entity was not just a piggy bank you could smash open and empty without setting off massive, unavoidable alarms. The Department of Justice and the Internal Revenue Service kept incredibly tight leashes on charitable foundations precisely to prevent this exact type of catastrophic financial plundering. Moving $15 million in liquid capital across international borders required significantly more than just administrative access, and Xavier's stolen departmental codes. It required a highly sophisticated laundering mechanism. I walked back to the heavy oak dining table, pulling a fresh stack of archive boxes toward me. We needed to map the exact route the money took from my grandfather Theodore's foundation into the digital abyss of NovaChain. Xavier was already 2 steps ahead, his fingers flying across his laptop keyboard as he compared the hospital audit logs with the Foundation quarterly tax filings. He brought up a heavily encrypted digital folder he had scraped from Brenda's private server directory before they terminated his access. The screen populated with dozens of highly complex wire transfer receipts. Caldwell leaned over Xavier's shoulder, his sharp legal mind instantly dissecting the financial labyrinth. The money did not go straight to Kyle's failing crypto exchange. That would have triggered an automatic federal audit the very second the funds left the domestic banking system. Brenda was cunning, but she was not working entirely alone. She used a network of offshore bridge loans to wash the foundation capital. She essentially borrowed clean money against the stolen funds, routing the clean cash into NovaChain while keeping the foundation digital ledgers looking temporarily balanced. It was a massive, highly illegal shell game designed to buy Kyle enough time to secure legitimate investors. Once the real investors bought into the pitch I had just ruined earlier today, Kyle was supposed to backfill the missing foundation money, leaving Brenda completely and entirely undetected. But bridge loans of that astronomical magnitude required perfectly solid, undeniable security. The offshore lenders issuing those massive, untraceable wires would never accept hypothetical crypto tokens or hollow promises as collateral. They demanded physical, ironclad assets to underwrite their risk. I began tearing through the physical loan agreements Xavier had printed out, tossing aside pages of dense legal jargon and liability clauses. The air in the room grew thick with tension as we realized the sheer scale of Brenda's deception. She had constructed a financial house of cards that was teetering on the absolute brink of total collapse. The entire operation depended entirely on Kyle securing that venture capital funding. Since I had just completely incinerated his pitch and shut down his servers, the offshore lenders were going to immediately call in their loans. The bridge was effectively burned, and the massive debt was suddenly due in full. Caldwell and I exchanged a rapid series of legal deductions, our voices echoing in the cavernous space. She needed physical collateral to secure the offshore bridge loan before routing it into Nova Chain. Caldwell stated, his brow deeply furrowed, as he scanned a secondary ledger. These lenders operate outside domestic jurisdiction. They do not care about credit scores. They only care about tangible, liquidatable assets. But what did she leverage? She has absolutely no assets of her own. She came into your father's life with expensive tastes and absolutely zero equity. He was entirely correct. Brenda had zero personal wealth. Her entire high society lifestyle was funded exclusively by my father's credit cards and his corporate accounts. She owned no real estate, no significant stock portfolios, and no legitimate businesses. Xavier tapped his laptop screen, bringing up a separate file window. He pulled a physical document from his leather briefcase and slid it across the table toward me. It was a highly classified bank authorization form, heavily redacted with thick black marker across the primary approval sections. He had found it buried deep in the hospital's executive correspondence logs, misfiled under a generic administrative heading. I picked up the thick parchment paper, noting the distinct embossed seal of my father's primary holding bank in the top right corner. The redactions were heavy, but they were surprisingly sloppy. The ink was slightly faded, applied hastily by someone who was rushing to cover their tracks before an external audit could flag the anomaly. I stepped away from the table and walked directly over to the bright crystal chandelier hanging above us. I held the heavily redacted bank document high up to the light, letting the intense concentrated bulbs illuminate the hidden text beneath the thick black marker. The bold, undeniable truth materialized right through the paper. It was an asset leverage authorization form, granting the offshore lending syndicate a direct, unencumbered lien against a massive domestic property in the event of a total default. I traced the faint outline of the signature at the bottom of the page. It was a near-perfect replica of my father's distinct, aggressive handwriting, but the pressure points were slightly off, indicating a slow, careful forgery rather than a natural, fluid signature. I slowly lowered the paper, feeling a chilling sense of absolute victory wash over me. Brenda had not just stolen from the charity. She had bet her entire lavish existence on Kyle's digital scam. She had signed away the ultimate prize just to keep her son's fraudulent empire afloat for a few more months. The sheer audacity of her crime was staggering, but it gave me the exact weapon I needed to finish this war once and for all. I turned back to Caldwell and Xavier, tossing the illuminated document directly onto the center of the massive oak table. Brenda was currently broadcasting her fabricated victimhood to the entire city, crying about how I was stealing my father's money and rendering him completely destitute. The tragic irony was that she had already done the job herself. She didn't use her assets, I stated loudly. She forged Richard's signature and leveraged his mansion. The sheer audacity of Brenda's forgery hung in the subterranean vault like a thick fog. Caldwell quickly pulled a silver magnifying loupe from his breast pocket, leaning over the heavily redacted document to examine the frantic, jagged strokes of the signature. He confirmed what I already knew. Brenda had perfectly copied the aesthetic of Richard's handwriting, but the pen pressure lacked his typical aggressive weight. She had signed away the sprawling Connecticut estate, the ultimate symbol of my father's corporate conquests, to secure a massive offshore bridge loan. I turned back to my laptop, my fingers flying across the keys as I bypassed a basic security firewall on the county clerk's public property registry. I needed to see exactly how far the rot had spread. I ran a cross-reference on the property identification number, pulling up the current lien status. The results loaded instantly, painting a picture of total financial devastation. When I shut down Kyle's servers earlier that afternoon, the automated offshore lending syndicate immediately registered a catastrophic default. The algorithm protecting the overseas capital did not waste a single second. It triggered an automatic seizure protocol, transferring the unserviceable debt to a domestic collections agency. The bank was actively foreclosing on Richard's beloved mansion. The foreclosure notices had already been generated, filed, and stamped by the county judge. My father was currently sitting in his velvet armchair ordering people around and sleeping under a roof he literally no longer owned. He was a squatter in his own fortress, and he had absolutely no idea. I had finally pieced together the ultimate checkmate. Not only was Brenda guilty of federal wire fraud, but Richard was completely ruined. Before Caldwell could even begin to outline the federal mandatory minimum sentencing guidelines for wire fraud, the heavy security buzzer at the front gate of my estate chimed loudly. I switched the camera feed to the main monitor. A single car was idling in the pouring rain. It was Zoe. I tapped the release button, granting her immediate access. Xavier stood up from the oak table, his posture instantly softening as he rushed up the spiral staircase to meet his wife. When they returned to the vault a few minutes later, Zoe looked completely exhausted. Her designer raincoat was soaked, and her normally perfect posture was slumped with the heavy burden of carrying our family's toxic secrets. She had spent the last several hours trapped inside Richard's house, listening to Brenda scream hysterically into her phone while my father paced the floors shouting threats at his attorneys. Zoe walked slowly toward the table, her eyes scanning the chaotic sea of financial documents, original banking ledgers, and printed audit trails we had meticulously assembled. I did not soften the blow or try to protect her from the ugly reality. I silently slid the forged bank authorization form and the federal tax discrepancy logs directly across the polished wood. Zoe picked up the papers with trembling hands. She read through the highlighted sections, her eyes tracking the massive sums of money flowing out of our grandfather's charitable foundation and into Kyle's fraudulent digital empire. She saw the undeniable proof of Brenda's calculated theft and the horrifying reality that her own husband had been set up to take the fall. The realization hit Zoe with physical force. The woman who had demanded constant respect and obedience was nothing but a ruthless, calculating parasite. Zoe gently set the documents back down on the table. She reached up and wiped a single tear from her cheek, her expression transforming from profound sorrow to cold, unbreakable resolve. She officially cut all remaining ties with our father and his manipulative wife right then and there. "They deserve whatever is coming to them," Zoe said, her voice completely stripped of any lingering hesitation. She walked around this table and stood firmly by Xavier's side, slipping her hand into his. We were no longer fragmented victims of Richard's conditional love or Brenda's toxic schemes. We were a united front, armed with the exact financial ammunition needed to tear their fabricated high society world down to the absolute studs. I turned back to my workstation and engaged the high-capacity laser printer sitting on the credenza. The machine whirred to life, rapidly spitting out thick, crisp pages of undeniable evidence. I printed the county foreclosure notices. I printed the offshore bridge loan agreements. I printed the exact digital server logs proving Kyle's crypto application was a hollow fabricated shell designed to launder stolen charity funds. The stack of paper grew higher and higher, a monument to their greed and arrogance. This was not just a legal defense for Xavier anymore. This was a fully weaponized arsenal. I gathered the freshly printed documents, tapping the edges against the mahogany table to align them into a perfectly neat, heavy stack. I looked across the room at Xavier. He had spent the last 6 months living under a dark cloud of anxiety, facing the destruction of his hard-earned medical career and the very real threat of federal prison. He had endured Richard's condescension and Brenda's vicious smear campaigns with quiet, dignified resilience. Now the heavy burden of false guilt was completely lifted from his shoulders. He stood taller, his jaw set with a fierce, unwavering determination. The unbelievable truth we now held in our hands was an absolute, undeniable game-changer. It was the flawless, meticulous execution of long-awaited justice that we had desperately needed all along to clear his good name permanently. I walked around the massive dining table and stopped right in front of him. I tossed the heavy stack of fresh foreclosure filings and wire fraud documents directly into his waiting hands. The thick packet landed with a satisfying authoritative thud. I looked at the three of them, feeling a massive surge of absolute power, knowing we were finally about to end this terrible nightmare. Get your best tailored suit ready, Xavier. We're crashing their precious Thanksgiving dinner this coming holiday weekend. The crisp autumn air bit through the evening as a steady stream of luxury vehicles snaked up the curving cobblestone driveway of my father's sprawling Connecticut estate. Valets in pristine uniforms jogged through the freezing rain, carefully parking a seemingly endless parade of sleek black Porsches, imported Mercedes sedans, and custom Bentleys. Thanksgiving at Richard's mansion was never just a simple family dinner. It was a highly orchestrated, exclusive showcase of wealth and influence designed specifically to remind everyone in the district who held the absolute most power. Tonight was meant to be the crowning jewel of the social season. Inside the grand ballroom, 50 of the city's most elite socialites were insulated from the cold, bathing in the warm glow of crystal chandeliers. They stood in small circles on imported Persian rugs, sipping vintage champagne from delicate flutes and picking at hors d'oeuvres circulated by hired catering staff. The room hummed with the low, steady murmur of old money and polite, meaningless conversation. At the center of the room, beside the roaring marble fireplace, Brenda was holding court with masterful precision. She wore a stunning emerald green couture gown, her hair perfectly styled to project an image of effortless grace. She was deeply engaged in conversation with the mayor's wife, a woman whose social endorsement was considered gospel in their circles. Brenda pressed a manicured hand to her chest, her face contorting into a mask of profound manufactured sorrow. She was actively soaking up sympathy, playing the role of the wounded matriarch to absolute perfection. She leaned close to the mayor's wife, her voice carrying enough volume to ensure surrounding guests could hear every chosen word. It is just so tragic when a child turns out so utterly broken and greedy. Brenda sighed, dabbing a fake tear from her eye. We gave Natalie absolutely everything. We tried to surround her with love to show her the right path, but some people are simply born with a vindictive nature. She tried to tear this family apart out of pure spite. The mayor's wife offered a sympathetic sound, patting Brenda's arm consolingly. We had absolutely no other choice. Brenda continued, her tone shifting to one of brave resignation. We have completely cut Natalie off for our own peace. A father must protect his legacy from those who wish to destroy it. A few feet away, Richard stood with local investors swirling a glass of expensive bourbon. He nodded solemnly, playing the part of the stoic patriarch weathering a terrible family storm, entirely oblivious to the fact that the very roof over his head was currently slipping out of his legal possession. While Brenda spun her web of lies inside the grand dining hall, I stood outside on the wet cobblestones, the freezing rain soaking into the hem of my trench coat. The valets tried to stop us at the security gate, but Caldwell flashed his credentials and threatened them with immediate legal action for obstructing federal evidence. They backed down instantly. I stood at the top of the stone steps leading to the main entrance, my heart hammering a steady rhythm against my ribs. I did not feel fear. I did not feel the crushing anxiety that had plagued me my entire life whenever I faced my father's judgment. I felt a cold, absolute certainty. Beside me, Xavier looked like a completely different man. Gone was the defeated doctor who had been stripped of his medical license and dignity. He wore a tailored charcoal suit that fit perfectly, his posture completely rigid and commanding. He carried himself with the lethal confidence of a man holding the absolute truth. On my other side, Caldwell stood tall and imposing, gripping a thick leather briefcase that contained the forensic accounting reports, the offshore loan documents, and the finalized county foreclosure notices. Zoe stood just behind us, her arms crossed tight, her face set in stone. She had wiped her tears hours ago and was now entirely ready to watch her father's empire crumble. I reached out and tightly gripped the heavy brass handles of the massive oak double doors. I did not knock. I did not ask for permission to enter my childhood home. I shoved the heavy doors inward with every ounce of physical strength I possessed. The crash of the heavy oak doors slamming against the pristine foyer walls sent a massive shockwave through the grand ballroom. The jazz band positioned in the corner to provide a sophisticated soundtrack for the evening immediately stopped playing. Their lively notes died out in an awkward jarring screech of a bow dragging against a cello string. The polite clinking of crystal champagne glasses ceased entirely. 50 elite socialites turned their heads in perfect unison, their expressions locked in bewildered shock. I stood tall in the entryway, rain dripping from my trench coat onto the polished marble floor. Beside me, Xavier maintained a rigid posture, while Caldwell stood perfectly still, his grip tightening on the leather briefcase containing their total destruction. Richard pushed his way through the frozen crowd of wealthy investors and local politicians. He turned a vibrant shade of purple with raw, unfiltered rage. His hands curled into tight fists at his sides. He marched directly toward us, his dress shoes striking the hardwood floor with heavy thuds. He did not care that the mayor and his wife were watching his complete loss of composure. He pointed a trembling, furious finger at my face, his chest heaving with rapid breaths. "I told you failures do not belong here, security," Richard bellowed, his voice echoing violently off the vaulted ceiling. Before the security team could step forward, Brenda materialized at Richard's side. She wore a vicious, triumphant smirk, eager to capitalize on the public spectacle to cement her fabricated narrative. She raised her voice, ensuring her sharp words reached every corner of the expansive ballroom. Brenda sneers loudly for the crowd. "Look, everyone, the squatter came to beg for turkey!" she mocked, waving her manicured hand with theatrical disgust. Natalie ignores them both completely. I did not dignify my father's screaming or Brenda's pathetic insults with a response. I kept my posture straight, my gaze fixed ahead, and walked with measured steps right past them. The sea of elite guests parted instinctively, creating a clear path for me to navigate. She walks directly to the jazz band's microphone stand, grabs the mic, and faces the room. "I am not here for the turkey, Brenda. I am here for asset repossession," I stated clearly. Richard let out a roar of absolute fury. Richard tries to grab the microphone, lunging across the Persian rug to rip the silver medal from my hand, but Xavier smoothly steps in his path, blocking him with an immovable, intimidating calm. Richard slammed into Xavier's chest, but my brother-in-law did not yield a single inch. "Let my sister-in-law speak, Richard," Xavier commanded, his voice dark and layered with the authority of a man who had nothing left to lose. I looked out at the silent, captive audience, my gaze sweeping over the city's most influential figures. I saw the mayor's wife clutching her pearl necklace, her eyes wide with horrified fascination. I saw the board members of my grandfather's charitable foundation standing frozen near the bar. "For those of you who do not know me, I am Natalie Richards' daughter," I announced, my voice steady. "My father and his new wife have spent the last few weeks weaving a highly fictionalized narrative about my character. They have stood in your exclusive country clubs and boardrooms shedding fake tears, claiming that I am a greedy, vindictive monster attempting to steal the family estate. Brenda has played the role of the devoted, victimized wife to perfection. She has happily accepted your sympathy while actively plotting a brazen financial crime." Brenda let out a shrill, panicked gasp. She took a step toward the stage, her emerald green couture gown swishing around her ankles, but Caldwell moved instantly to intercept her, blocking her path with his heavy body. "However, numbers do not share Brenda's talent for fiction." I continued, pacing slowly across the small, raised platform. "My grandfather built a philanthropic foundation designed to help underprivileged children. It was his greatest legacy. Over the last 6 months, exactly $15 million has been systematically drained from that charity." A collective gasp rippled through the ballroom. The foundation board members exchanged horrified glances. Richard whipped his head around to stare at Brenda, his face draining of color. "She bled the foundation dry to float a fraudulent cryptocurrency exchange run by her son Kyle," I stated. "She used stolen administrative codes to pin the entire massive theft on my brother-in-law, Dr. Xavier, intentionally destroying a brilliant medical career to buy herself a convenient, believable scapegoat," I declared. "Lies!" Brenda shrieked, her voice cracking with pure desperation. She is a delusional liar. Richard, make her stop this instantly. But a $15 million offshore loan requires undeniable physical collateral. I continued, ignoring her screaming entirely. The international lenders do not accept hypothetical digital tokens. They demand tangible assets. Since Brenda brought absolutely zero personal wealth into this marriage, she had a very serious logistical problem. She solved that problem by committing federal wire fraud. She desperately needed to secure the massive bridge loans before she could successfully route the stolen funds into her son's sinking digital empire. I gestured toward Caldwell. He snapped the latches on his leather briefcase open and pulled out a thick stack of freshly printed documents. He walked through the crowd, handing the heavily redacted bank forms directly to the mayor, the local investors, and the foundation board members. She did not use her own assets, I declared, my voice echoing off the marble walls with absolute finality. She forged your signature, Richard. She leveraged this exact sprawling mansion, the very roof over your head, to secure the illicit offshore funding. Because I shut down Kyle's servers earlier today, the automated lending syndicate immediately registered a catastrophic default. The bank is actively foreclosing on this estate as we speak. Richard staggered backward as if he had been physically struck, his eyes dropping to the foreclosure notice Caldwell placed directly into his trembling hands. The silence in the ballroom was absolute, broken only by the ragged breathing of the man who had ruled this empire through fear. Richard stared at the foreclosure notice in his trembling hands, the blood draining from his flushed face. The words on the page were an undeniable death sentence to his fabricated reality, stripping away the beautiful, lavish illusion he constructed for decades. The 50 elite socialites remained frozen in captivated horror. They were currently watching the biggest titan among them unravel in real time. The jazz band remained still, clutching their instruments like shields against the explosive tension. The clinking of glasses had ceased entirely. Every eye in the opulent room was locked on to me. I gripped the microphone stand, anchoring myself against the weight of a lifetime of conditional love. I looked at the faces of the men and women who had accepted my father's narrative of supremacy, while he crushed anyone who dared to stand in his way. My father called me a disgrace online this week. I announced, my voice steady, stripped of any childhood fear. He painted a compelling picture of a self-made patriarch burdened by an ungrateful, vindictive daughter. He loves to tell the story of how he built Wilson Manufacturing from the ground up in order to secure his place among all of you. He built his entire identity on the myth of his own infallible genius. But let us talk about 10 years ago. Let us talk about the truth. I paused, letting the silence stretch out, allowing the anticipation to build until the tension in the room was suffocating. Richard took a threatening step forward, but Caldwell shifted his weight, a silent warning that kept my father locked in place. When Richard's firm secretly went bankrupt 10 years ago, he was ruined. I revealed, the amplified words slicing through his curated legacy. He had over-leveraged every single asset, gambled on international expansions, and lost everything. It was Grandpa Theodore who bailed him out. My grandfather stepped in to save the family name from public disgrace, but Grandpa did not trust Richard. He knew exactly what kind of reckless, arrogant man my father was. The crowd shifted, a murmur rippling through the elite guests. I saw the mayor lean in closer to his wife, his eyes fixed on my face, absorbing every detail. He used my $80 million trust fund to buy out Richard's debt, I declared, delivering the final blow to his ego. I have owned my father's company for a decade. Every major decision, every pivot, every acquisition over the last 10 years required my silent proxy approval through the holding company. He was merely an employee in the empire he claimed to rule. I stayed silent to protect his fragile ego. I allowed him to parade around this city pretending to be a self-made king because I mistakenly believed protecting his pride was my duty. The humiliation washing over Richard's face was a sight. His entire reality, the foundation of his arrogance, had just been publicly annihilated. The men he golfed with, the politicians he funded, the rivals he had condescended to for years, were now looking at him not with respect, but with pity. Lies! Richard screamed, spittle flying from his lips as he completely lost whatever remained of his civilized facade. She is delusional. She has lost her mind. He lunged toward the stage, his hands outstretched, desperate to rip the microphone from my grip and silence the truth. But before his leather shoes could touch the edge of the platform, Xavier stepped directly into his path. My brother-in-law did not brace for impact or raise his fists. He simply stood there, blocking Richard with an immovable, intimidating calm that radiated quiet, lethal power. "Let my sister-in-law speak, Richard," Xavier commanded, his voice barely above a whisper, but carrying enough authority to freeze my father in his tracks. Without breaking eye contact with the man who tried to destroy his medical career and marriage, Xavier reached inside his charcoal suit. He unbuttoned his jacket, pulling out a thick, organized stack of documents. They were copies of the original corporate buyout contracts, bearing Theodore's signature, my trust fund, routing numbers, and Richard's own desperate endorsement from a decade ago. Xavier turned his back on my father, stepping calmly toward the front row of captivated guests. He began handing the proof directly into the hands of Richard's most vital business partners, investors, and the mayor himself, sealing the bankrupt king's total destruction. The physical proof of my absolute ownership over Richard's supposedly self-made empire circulated through the manicured hands of the city's most powerful figures. Whispers erupted like striking matches, instantly igniting a wildfire of scandalized realization across the opulent space. Investors who had spent the entire evening hanging on Richard's every arrogant boast now stared at him with naked disgust. The grand illusion of the invincible patriarch had been reduced to ash in seconds. Amidst the suffocating tension, the sharp, frantic scuff of leather shoes against the marble floor violently shattered the murmurs. Kyle lunged out from the shadow of the fireplace. Brenda's golden child, the self-proclaimed visionary of the digital frontier, looked absolutely unhinged. His designer tuxedo jacket hung awkwardly off his frame, and beads of terrified sweat plastered his perfectly styled hair to his forehead. He had spent the last 2 years cultivating an aura of untouchable tech bro genius, soliciting massive investments from the exact people standing in this room. Now watching his mother's fraudulent foundation schemes and his stepfather's humiliating bankruptcy exposed to the open air, Kyle realized his own fabricated reputation was next on the chopping block. He charged aggressively across the Persian rug, his face twisted, in an ugly snarl, desperate to save face in front of the assembled venture capitalists. Kyle stopped inches from Xavier, his chest heaving, his fists tightly clenched, as if he intended to settle this forensic accounting dispute with a physical brawl. Xavier did not flinch. He did not step backward. He merely looked down at Kyle with the detached, analytical observation of a seasoned medical professional. "You think you are so smart, doctor?" Kyle spat, his voice cracking with panicked aggression. He pointed a trembling, manicured finger directly at Xavier's chest. "You think you can just march into our house and ruin our family with these fabricated documents? You are just a diversity hire. My stepdad pities. A failed surgeon, looking for a quick payout because you could not cut it in the real world." A collective, horrified gasp rippled through the gathered crowd. The sheer audacity and racist undertone of the insult hung in the chilled air, a desperate flailing attempt by a cornered coward to tear down a man of infinitely superior character. Zoe stiffened beside me, her eyes flashing with a protective, lethal fury, ready to verbally obliterate her stepbrother. But Xavier held up a single calm hand, silently asking his wife to let him handle this. Xavier did not raise his voice. He did not need to. When he spoke, his tone was so remarkably even, so devoid of any emotional reaction to Kyle's pathetic slur, that it commanded absolute authority. He looked at Kyle not with anger, but with profound, devastating pity. "A diversity hire who actually knows how to read an audit trail, Kyle," Xavier replied, his smooth baritone slicing through the heavy silence of the ballroom. He adjusted the cuffs of his tailored suit, his gaze locking onto Kyle with predatory precision. Let us talk about your brilliance. Let us talk about Nova Chain. You pitched it to half the people in this room as a groundbreaking financial revolution. You promised them a secure future. But Nova Chain was not a tech revolution. It was a blatantly obvious, poorly constructed Ponzi scheme. Kyle's face drained of blood, turning a sickly, translucent white. He opened his mouth to interrupt, to scream his usual practiced buzzwords about blockchain disruption and crypto analytics, but the words died in his throat. You built a hollow digital facade to funnel the $15 million your mother stole from the charity Foundation! Xavier continued, stepping 1 inch closer, forcing Kyle to instinctively shrink back. You needed a mechanism to wash the stolen money before transferring it to the offshore lending syndicate, so you set up a Cayman shell company. You layered the transactions through multiple dummy wallets, assuming the basic encryption would hide your tracks from domestic authorities. You thought you were an untouchable digital ghost. Xavier smiled, a sharp, cold expression that offered absolutely no mercy. He reached into his inside jacket pocket and pulled out a single folded sheet of paper. He did not hand it to the investors. He held it up directly in front of Kyle's face. The problem with pretending to be a tech genius, Kyle, is that you actually have to understand basic operational security, Xavier stated, his voice ringing out for the entire ballroom to hear. You used a Cayman shell company to wash the money, but you made a catastrophic amateur mistake. You completely forgot to mask your IP address when you logged into the admin portal to authorize the final massive transfer. You did not use a proxy. You did not bounce the signal. You logged directly into the fraudulent server from the primary Wi-Fi network located inside this exact house. The silence in the room deepened into a suffocating vacuum. The investors who had previously poured their own capital into Kyle's ventures began stepping away from him, physically distancing themselves from a massive federal crime. We have the digital server logs, Kyle, Xavier explained, speaking with the patient cadence of a teacher explaining a simple concept to a slow student. We traced the exact administrative login back to the router bolted to the wall in your stepfather's home office. You left a glowing digital breadcrumb trail leading federal investigators right to Brenda's stolen charity funds and straight into your fraudulent Cayman accounts. You did not build an empire. You built a digital prison cell for yourself and your mother. Kyle stood paralyzed, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish. The arrogant tech bro had been entirely dismantled. He looked wildly around the room, finding only furious stares from the investors he scammed. He stumbled backward, bumping a tall cocktail table, sending crystal champagne flutes crashing to the floor. Brenda panicked, looking at Mr. Pierce, her lawyer, who was now standing near the buffet. Pierce, sue them, defamation, do something. The shattered crystal champagne flutes were still chiming against the polished marble floor when Brenda's frantic screech shattered the remaining silence. She pointed a trembling, manicured finger toward the lavish buffet, spread her emerald gown shaking as she sought her ultimate shield. Mr. Pierce. The family's notoriously ruthless corporate attorney wiped a dab of caviar from his mouth with a linen napkin. He was a man who had built an entire career out of intimidating weaker opponents, crushing small businesses, and burying Richard's indiscretions under mountains of aggressive litigation. He smoothed the lapels of his custom Italian suit, projecting an aura of absolute unshakable authority. He stepped out from the shadows of the dining hall, his expensive leather shoes crunching over the broken glass without a single glance downward. He marched directly toward our united front, his eyes locked onto Caldwell with the predatory glare of a shark spotting bleeding prey. Pierce did not view us as a legitimate threat. He saw us as a minor, irritating pest control problem that required a swift, legal extermination. He stopped just inches from Caldwell, thrusting his chest out to maximize his physical presence. He pointed a sharp, threatening finger at my lawyer's face. Pierce demanded that Caldwell issue a full, immediate, and public retraction of every single statement made in this room. He threatened Caldwell with immediate legal ruin, promising to file a dozen defamation lawsuits before midnight. He vowed to strip Caldwell of his license, to bankrupt his firm, and to drag his professional reputation through the mud until there was absolutely nothing left. He spoke with the venomous confidence of a man who believed his client was invincible. Caldwell did not flinch. He did not take a defensive step backward. He did not utter a single syllable in response to the aggressive theatrical monologue. Caldwell simply stared at the arrogant attorney with a look of profound clinical boredom. The absolute silence from my lawyer unnerved Pierce, causing his aggressive posture to falter for just a fraction of a second. Caldwell slowly and deliberately hoisted his heavy leather briefcase onto the nearest cocktail table. He flicked the brass latches open with two sharp, authoritative clicks that echoed loudly through the completely silent ballroom. He reached his large hands inside and retrieved a thick, heavy stack of crisp white paper. This was not a bluff. This was the fully documented, undeniable culmination of a 6-month forensic investigation. Caldwell pulled out the federal wire fraud evidence, the meticulously highlighted digital server logs, the SEC violation reports, and the crown jewel of our arsenal, the original, forged mortgage documents. Caldwell turned back to Pierce. He did not hand the documents over politely. He shoved the entire heavy stack directly into the center of Pierce's chest, with enough physical force to make the aggressive attorney stumble backward. Pierce grunted in surprise, his arms automatically coming up to catch the heavy stack of evidence before it scattered across the floor. He scowled at Caldwell, adjusting his designer glasses as he looked down at the top sheet. He intended to mock the paperwork, to laugh off our evidence as amateur fabrications, but as his eyes scanned the first paragraph, his arrogant sneer froze entirely. The room watched in absolute captivated silence as Pierce read the federal seal stamped on the wire fraud report. He flipped to the second page, his eyes darting frantically across the detailed SEC violation logs documenting Kyle's Cayman Islands Shell Company. Then he reached the third document. It was the heavily redacted, perfectly traced mortgage deed bearing Richard's forged signature, complete with the undeniable timestamp of Brenda's unauthorized offshore transfer. The transformation was instantaneous and spectacular to witness. The color completely drained from Pierce's face, leaving his skin a sickly pale gray. His hands began to shake violently, the expensive paper rattling against his fingertips. The arrogant corporate predator vanished, replaced by a terrified man staring at the barrel of a federal indictment. Pierce was not just reading about his client's crimes. He was reading the absolute destruction of his own career. As Richard's primary counsel, he had unwittingly filed the preliminary paperwork for the foundation's recent restructuring. Brenda had used his prestigious law firm as a legitimate shield to mask her criminal enterprise. The SEC violation reports clearly implicated his office in the transactional chain. If these documents reached a federal judge, Pierce would not just lose his license to practice law. He would be facing decades in a federal penitentiary as an accessory to wire fraud. The realization hit him with the force of a freight train. Pierce's breathing became shallow and ragged. He looked up from the documents, his eyes wide with sheer terror. He stared at Brenda, who was currently attempting to maintain her posture of wounded innocence. The absolute horror in his gaze stripped away any remaining doubt in the room. The 50 elite socialites, the mayor, and the investors watched as the powerful lawyer completely unraveled. Pierce did not attempt to negotiate. He did not threaten Caldwell with defamation again. He operated purely on raw survival instinct. He marched aggressively toward Brenda, his expensive shoes sliding slightly on the polished marble. Brenda offered him a pleading look, silently begging him to fix the disaster unfolding around them. Instead, Pierce violently shoved the entire stack of incriminating papers directly back into her chest. The sharp edges of the paper caught the silk fabric of her couture gown as she frantically grabbed them to prevent them from falling. "You lied to me! You forged the deed!" Pierce screamed, his voice stripped of its smooth corporate polish. The raw panic in his tone echoed through the grand foyer, confirming every accusation I made. Brenda gasped, stumbling against the marble fireplace. He spun around his chest, heaving his face slick. He turned to the crowd, raised his hands, and yelled, "I formally withdraw as counsel. I have nothing to do with this woman." He literally runs out the large front doors. The heavy front doors slam shut behind the fleeing attorney, the booming echo vibrating violently through the grand ballroom. A profound, suffocating silence immediately filled the space left in his wake. 50 of the most influential people in the city stood perfectly rigid, their champagne glasses suspended in midair, their eyes darting frantically between the grand entrance and the corner where my father stood. The mayor's wife actually pressed a hand to her chest, her mouth slightly open in unfiltered shock. The jazz band remained entirely frozen, the cellist still gripping his bow as if his life depended on it. No one dared to speak. No one dared to breathe. The sheer magnitude of the scandal was intoxicating to the socialites who lived for this exact kind of downfall. The pristine facade of the Wilson Empire, meticulously maintained for decades through intimidation and carefully orchestrated charity galas, was crumbling before their very eyes. The invincible armor surrounding the Wilson family had not just cracked, it had shattered into a million irreparable pieces. Brenda stood entirely alone by the buffet table, clutching the crumpled stack of federal indictments against her chest, her emerald gown suddenly looking less like a symbol of wealth and more like a neon target. Without missing a single beat, Caldwell smoothed the lapels of his custom suit and stepped up onto the small raised platform beside me. He savored the absolute control he now held over the entire room. He moved with the predatory grace of a man who had just won a war without breaking a sweat. He adjusted the silver microphone stand, pulling it slightly downward. The sharp squeal of audio feedback pierced the quiet room, causing several wealthy investors to physically flinch. Caldwell did not tap the microphone or offer a polite greeting. He simply leaned in his deep, resonant voice, projecting unquestionable authority over the captive audience. He locked his gaze directly onto my father, who was still staring blankly at the front door, where his prized legal shield had just evaporated into the night. "Ladies and gentlemen," Caldwell announced, his tone clinical and devastatingly precise, "allow me to clarify the exact nature of the documents that just caused your host's attorney to sprint into the street. 6 months ago, Brenda committed a brazen act of federal wire fraud. She desperately needed liquid capital to fund her son's failing illegal cryptocurrency scheme. She required an immediate infusion of $15 million to appease the offshore lending syndicate threatening to liquidate her son's entirely hollow enterprise." Caldwell paused, letting the staggering monetary figure settle over the crowd. The foundation board members exchanged horrified whispers. "However, offshore syndicates do not accept imaginary digital tokens as collateral," Caldwell continued smoothly. "They require hard physical assets. Brenda possessed absolutely zero personal wealth to leverage. She solved this massive logistical problem by forging her husband's signature on a binding legal contract." Caldwell raised a duplicate copy of the heavily redacted deed, holding it up to the chandelier light for the entire room to witness. "She took out a $15 million commercial bridge loan directly against this very mansion. She leveraged the roof over your heads, the walls surrounding you, and the Persian rugs beneath your feet. And because we permanently severed Kyle's server access earlier today, that exact loan officially registered a catastrophic default 30 days ago." Richard physically staggered, stumbling sideways until his shoulder hit a marble column for support. He looked like a man who had just been forcefully dragged from a deep sleep into a living nightmare. He raised a shaking hand to his forehead, completely unable to process the magnitude of the betrayal. He had spent his entire life building an impenetrable fortress of wealth, only to discover his new wife had sold the foundation right out from under him. The absolute humiliation of having this broadcast to the city's most powerful figures stripped him of every defense mechanism he possessed. He was completely exposed, vulnerable, and publicly ruined. He turned his head slowly, his eyes locking onto Brenda. The raw, unfiltered horror warping his features was almost difficult to look at. The arrogant self-made king was entirely gone, replaced by a broken old man, realizing he had been sleeping next to a parasite. "You mortgaged my house," Richard demanded, his voice cracking, entirely stripped of its usual booming authority. He pushed himself off the marble column, taking a trembling step toward his wife. "You forged my name and mortgaged the house I built." Brenda scrambled backward, her expensive heels slipping against the polished hardwood. She shook her head frantically, her blonde hair falling out of its elaborate updo and sticking to her tear-streaked face. "Richard, please listen to me," she begged, her voice high and breathless. "It was only temporary. Kyle promised the market would rebound. He guaranteed we would pay it back before you ever found out. I was trying to save our family." "Your family, Brenda, not his," Caldwell interjected, his voice slicing through her pathetic excuses like a scalpel. Caldwell smiled, then a sharp, merciless expression that promised total destruction. He turned back to the microphone, his eyes finding mine for a brief moment of shared victory before addressing my father once more. "There is one final detail you must understand, Richard. The offshore syndicate holding that defaulted $15 million note panicked when the federal investigation rumors surfaced. They sold the debt yesterday morning at a steep discount to an anonymous American holding company." Caldwell let the silence stretch, forcing Richard to hang on every single syllable. The entire ballroom held its breath, sensing the ultimate checkmate approaching. "That anonymous American holding company," Caldwell continued, his voice vibrating with absolute finality, "the entity that purchased your defaulted mortgage and officially took possession of the deed, is a parent LLC completely owned and operated by your daughter." Caldwell stepped back from the microphone, gesturing gracefully toward me. "Which means Richard, Natalie officially owns the house you're standing in." The revelation that I was the anonymous American holding company, the sole owner of the very ground beneath their feet, hung in the ballroom air like a guillotine blade slowly dropping. Richard deflated. The imposing patriarch who had dictated my entire existence shrank into a pathetic hollow shell. He looked from Caldwell to me, his mouth opening and closing silently. He spent 10 years treating me as a disappointment, a failure who could not measure up to his corporate standards, while I secretly held the leash to his kingdom. Now I owned his sanctuary. Brenda let out a shrill, suffocating gasp. She looked wildly around the grand foyer, searching for an exit, an ally, or a scapegoat. She found nothing but 50 pairs of eyes staring back at her with unadulterated contempt. The elite socialites she had desperately courted were stepping away, pulling their silk gowns close to avoid contamination. "Kyle, do something!" Brenda shrieked, grabbing her son's tuxedo sleeve. "Explain it! Tell them it is a misunderstanding!" But Kyle was completely broken. The digital fortress he built his arrogant identity upon had been exposed as a transparent fraud. The reality of a federal penitentiary loomed before him, stripping away his arrogant bravado and leaving a terrified child in its place. He ripped his arm away from his mother's fingers, pushing her backward so forcefully she stumbled against the marble staircase railing. "You said the money was clean," Kyle screamed, his voice cracking into a hysterical, shrill, pathetic wail. He completely ignored the nearby mayor. He did not care about the charity board members or venture capitalists watching his total collapse. He pointed a shaking finger directly at his mother's pale face. "You said Grandpa's charity was untraceable. You promised me the foundation's administrative accounts were shielded from federal oversight. I just built the portal. You are the one who stole $15 million. You swore no one would ever notice the transfer." The collective gasp from the ballroom crowd was deafening. The board members of my grandfather's philanthropic foundation stood paralyzed in absolute shock. Kyle had just handed them a full, public confession to a massive federal crime, in a room packed with the city's most powerful witnesses. He had effectively driven the final nail into his own coffin simply to ensure his mother went down with him. Brenda lunged at him, clamping her manicured hand over his mouth. "Shut up!" she hissed, her eyes wide with feral panic. She turned toward the crowd, offering a grotesque, trembling smile. "He is just stressed. The business has put him under immense pressure. He does not know what he is saying. Natalie is manipulating the data to frame us." Xavier stepped forward, completely unbothered by her frantic theatrical performance. He casually pulled back the crisp cuff of his tailored suit and checked his wristwatch, a gesture of absolute dominating calm amidst their chaotic, pathetic meltdown. Untraceable, Xavier asked, his smooth baritone carrying easily across the silent, captivated foyer. Brenda, the IRS, and the SEC have software that tracks blockchain ledgers in milliseconds. Did you really think you could embezzle $15 million from a federally monitored charity and no one would notice? He lowered his arm, his dark eyes locking onto her terrified face. You honestly thought routing stolen funds through a crypto exchange would make the money invisible. But public ledgers are exactly that, entirely public. Every single transaction, every wallet transfer, every offshore jump was permanently recorded on the blockchain. You did not successfully hide your massive crime. You essentially published a highly detailed digital receipt for the federal government. You framed me for a theft that was inherently impossible to hide from trained forensic investigators. Richard slowly sank into a velvet accent chair near the grand entryway, his trembling hands covering his flushed face. The man who had fiercely valued his public reputation above his own daughter's mental health was currently sitting in the absolute wreckage of a scandal that would dominate the national news cycle for months. His second wife was a confirmed embezzler. His stepson was an exposed fraud. His ruthless lawyer had abandoned him. His massive company belonged to me. His sprawling house belonged to me. He had absolutely nothing left to control. The venture capitalists who had generously funded Kyle's lavish lifestyle began urgently pulling out their phones, frantically dialing their legal teams to mitigate their sudden exposure to the NovaChain disaster. The jazz band had quietly packed their expensive instruments rapidly, abandoning their posts in the corner to avoid association. The lavish catered spread sat entirely untouched, a mocking testament to the extravagant celebration Brenda had arrogantly planned to cement her social dominance. Zoe stepped up proudly beside Xavier, her posture radiating a fierce protective pride. She looked at our father sitting broken in the chair, then at Brenda, who was still desperately trying to shush a hyperventilating Kyle. The years of cruel emotional manipulation, the constant unfair comparison, the relentless drive for impossible perfection had culminated in this exact moment of poetic, unyielding justice. We had not ruthlessly destroyed our family. We had simply held up a polished mirror to the toxic rot that had been festering beneath the surface for decades. You have exactly 5 minutes to gather whatever personal items you can carry, Brenda, I stated, my voice echoing with finality. As the legal owner of this property, I am formally evicting you. You are trespassing. Brenda opened her mouth to argue, to scream another vicious lie, to demand a lawyer she no longer possessed. But the desperate words never materialized. Right on cue, a harsh strobing light cut fiercely through the darkness outside. Flashing red and blue lights illuminated the stained glass windows, flanking the grand entryway, casting eerie, shifting colors across the marble floor. The heavy iron-wrought handles of the doors rattled violently. They were pushed open with immense, undeniable force by a dozen stern-faced FBI agents in windbreakers, their badges gleaming under the crystal chandeliers. The lead FBI agent marched straight past the paralyzed socialites and terrified venture capitalists. Her team of 12 heavily armed agents fanned out across the grand foyer with tactical precision, securing every single exit and establishing total control over the chaotic ballroom. They moved with a silent, heavy authority that completely suffocated the last remaining whispers of the elite crowd. The lead agent locked her sights on the corner where Brenda and Kyle stood frozen. Brenda's hands hovered near her face, her eyes wide with a feral trapped panic. She took one trembling step backward, her emerald couture gown swishing loudly against the polished marble floor, but two sturdy agents immediately flanked her. They grabbed her wrists, twisting her arms behind her back with practiced, unyielding force. Brenda erupted into a violent, thrashing frenzy. She screamed loudly, kicking her expensive heels at the federal agents. The heavy steel handcuffs snapped shut over her wrists, the sharp metallic click echoing loudly over her hysterical shrieks. The expensive silk of her designer dress tore slightly at the shoulder as she resisted the arrest, her blonde hair unraveling into a tangled mess across her tear-streaked face. Just a few feet away, Kyle completely disintegrated. The arrogant crypto bro who spent the last 2 years flaunting stolen wealth and mocking my work ethic simply collapsed under the crushing weight of reality. As an agent firmly gripped his tuxedo shoulder and ordered him to face the wall, Kyle burst into ugly tears. His knees buckled, forcing the agent to haul him back to a standing position. He began hyperventilating, his chest heaving as he sobbed uncontrollably. He begged the stern agents with a shrill, cracking voice, promising to return every single cent, swearing repeatedly that it was all his mother's idea. He begged them not to ruin his life, citing his youth and his supposed absolute ignorance of the law. His pathetic wails filled the grand room, shattering whatever illusion of superiority he had left. The wealthy venture capitalists, who had funded his lavish parties, looked away in sheer disgust, instantly distancing themselves from the weeping fraud. The agents patted him down, read his Miranda rights in a flat, monotone voice, and marched him toward the flashing red and blue lights waiting outside the grand entrance. Brenda was dragged out right behind him, still screaming vicious curses at Caldwell, at Xavier, and finally at Richard, who stood completely useless by the grand sweeping staircase. With the federal agents clearing the room of the criminals, the remaining guests took their immediate cue. The mayor and his wife practically sprinted for the coat check, followed swiftly by the board members and elite socialites. Within minutes, the massive, opulent ballroom emptied out entirely, leaving behind nothing but half-filled champagne flutes, abandoned plates of expensive caviar, and a chilling, hollow silence. Richard remained standing near the thick marble pillar, his chest rising and falling in shallow, erratic gasps. The absolute reality of his dire situation finally crashed down upon him. His pristine reputation was utterly annihilated. His prestigious foundation was the center of a massive federal embezzlement scandal. His second wife and stepson were currently sitting in the back of an FBI cruiser. But most devastating of all, he was completely bankrupt and functionally homeless. He slowly turned his head, looking at the grand crystal chandelier, the sweeping mahogany staircase, the priceless Persian rugs, and then finally at me. The invincible titan of industry, the man who had spent 33 years making sure I knew I was a massive disappointment, completely broke. His legs gave out beneath him. Richard collapsed onto the cold marble floor, falling directly to his knees in front of me. His custom designer suit pooled pathetically around his shaking frame. He looked up, his eyes bloodshot and brimming with desperate, unfiltered terror. "Natalie, please!" Richard begged, his voice a hoarse, scraping whisper that echoed pathetically in the empty foyer. He reached out a trembling hand, grasping at the empty air just inches from my shoes. "I am your father. You have the $80 million. You now own the company. Save me. Do not leave me with nothing." I stood perfectly still, looking down at the broken man kneeling before me. I searched my heart for a single ounce of pity, a shred of daughterly affection, or even a flicker of regret. I found absolutely nothing but cold, hardened resolve. This was the man who had actively excluded me from his life, who had funded my replacement's lavish lifestyle while relentlessly belittling my hard work, and who had gleefully planned to leave me with nothing but a worthless, empty title. He had traded his own flesh and blood for a superficial illusion of power, and now that the grand illusion had evaporated, he selfishly expected me to serve as his ultimate safety net. I looked at his desperate, pleading face, recognizing clearly that he did not regret his decades of cruelty. He only regretted that he had lost the game. I tilted my head slightly, silently studying his broken posture with a cold, clinical detachment. My voice was entirely devoid of pity, ringing out with absolute, unshakable authority. "You texted me not to show my face here, Richard. I am just here to collect my keys. You have until Monday at 8 a.m. to vacate my property." I absolutely did not wait for his pathetic response. I also did not watch the final shreds of his pride shatter into dust. I simply turned my back on the very man who had once discarded me. I walked slowly and steadily toward the grand entrance, my heels clicking sharply against the polished marble floor. Xavier and Caldwell fell into step right beside me, our united front, moving with purposeful, synchronized grace. We finally walked out through the heavy oak doors, leaving Richard completely alone in the echoing, empty mansion, kneeling silently in the ruins of his own making as the cold night air welcomed us into a brand new world. 6 months passed. The justice system moved with a slow, grinding efficiency that leveled the false realities my father and his new family had constructed. The federal penitentiary in Danbury operated on a strict, unyielding schedule, completely indifferent to social status or previous wealth. Brenda wore a shapeless khaki uniform, a jarring contrast to the emerald couture gown she had been arrested in. She spent her days scrubbing industrial metal trays in the prison cafeteria. The woman who once hosted lavish charity galas now ate tasteless food under the watchful eyes of armed guards. Her manicured hands were now raw calloused and permanently stained with grease. She had attempted to leverage her remaining social connections to secure a lighter sentence or better accommodations, but her elite friends had evaporated the second the handcuffs clicked shut. She was simply another inmate serving a lengthy federal sentence for wire fraud, completely stripped of the unearned luxury she valued above human decency. Miles away, under the flickering, harsh glare of a neon sign, Kyle experienced his own brutal reality check. He worked the graveyard shift at a cheap local burger joint on the outskirts of the city. The heavy scent of stale frying oil clung permanently to his hair and skin. He wore a cheap polyester uniform that was slightly too large, his name tag pinned crookedly over his chest. At 2 a.m, a customized sports car pulled up to the window. Kyle handed a greasy paper bag to a laughing teenager sitting behind the wheel of the exact vehicle model he used to drive. Kyle did not say a single word. He closed the sliding window, turning his back to the mocking laughter, finally understanding the agonizing weight of having to work for a living. His imaginary cryptocurrency empire was a deleted footnote in federal evidence files, leaving him with nothing but minimum wage and a mop. He was trapped in a greasy nightmare of his own making, forced to answer to teenagers who treated him with the exact same cruel arrogance he had once shown the world. Richard suffered a devastating downfall. He woke up every morning to the jarring mechanical roar of garbage trucks backing up in a narrow alleyway. He lived in a cramped, poorly insulated studio apartment on the wrong side of the city. The air inside smelled perpetually of stale coffee and profound defeat. A single scratched wooden table held a neat stack of formal rejection letters from every exclusive country club and private dining society in the state area. The elite circle he had spent 33 years courting had completely ostracized him. Former business partners refused to take his calls. Old golfing buddies crossed the street when they saw him. He drank cheap, bitter coffee from a chipped ceramic mug, staring blankly at the peeling wallpaper of his tiny kitchen. The invincible corporate titan who mercilessly belittled me for decades now had no company, no mansion, and zero social standing. He possessed exactly what he tried to leave me with. He had absolutely nothing. He was finally a fallen king without a kingdom, left completely alone to rot in his pathetic misery. While they faced the harsh consequences of their greed, I methodically dismantled the remnants of their toxic legacy. The tall boardroom overlooking the Chicago skyline offered a perfect view of the city. I sat at the head of a massive mahogany table alongside Caldwell. He neatly aligned the final stack of legal documents marking the total, irreversible liquidation of Richard's former firm. We systematically dismantled the company, selling off its physical assets, transferring the viable client portfolios, and shutting down the corrupt administrative channels my father built. The financial yield from the liquidation, combined with the recovered funds from the federal investigation, was staggering. I picked up a sleek metal pen and signed my name on the final authorization line. Caldwell closed the leather binder with a satisfying snap. I turned my attention to the other end of the long table. Xavier and Zoe sat quietly watching the proceedings with a mixture of awe and quiet vindication. I reached into my leather briefcase and retrieved a single heavy piece of crisp paper. I slid the massive certified check across the polished wood. Xavier stopped it with his fingertips, his eyes widening as he registered the enormous sum. Use it to build the biggest, most advanced private trauma center in the state. I instructed, my voice steady and completely clear. Hire the best doctors. Buy the best equipment. Ensure that no patient ever feels the way our family made people feel. Zoe looked up from the check, tears of genuine gratitude shining in her eyes. No dirty money, I added, offering a warm, genuine smile to the siblings who had stood by my side when it mattered most. Just family. The scene shifted from the cold corporate heights of the city to the lush hills of the countryside. Grandpa Theodore's original estate stood proudly against the vibrant hues of the setting sun. I poured my resources and my heart into flawlessly restoring the sprawling property to its historical glory. The grand columns gleamed with fresh paint, the extensive gardens bloomed with renewed life, and the heavy oak doors stood open, welcoming the warm evening breeze. I had rebuilt the foundation of our true family legacy with my own hands. I stepped onto the sweeping stone balcony, the delicate crystal of a wine glass cool against my fingers. Zoe and Xavier joined me, leaning comfortably against the ornate stone railing. We raised our glasses of incredibly expensive vintage red wine, the crystal chiming musically in the quiet evening air. We drank to the future, free from the suffocating shadows of the past. There was no golden child here. There was no designated scapegoat. There was just a woman who knew her absolute worth, kept her secrets, and built her own thriving empire directly from the ashes of their greed. Then fade to black.